All right, directors, when I call your name, please indicate if you are here. Director Bernasconi? Absent. Director Burris? Absent. Director Frericks?
I am here.
Director Gog?
Yes.
Director Lozano?
Here.
Director Middleton?
Here.
Director Stollard?
Here.
Director Thomas? Absent. Vice Chair Zaragoza? Looks like he's in the waiting room. And Chair Kozlowski.
Here.
All right.
Everybody, please join me for the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance
To the flag
of the United States of America and to the
republic for which it stands,
one nation,
under God,
indivisible,
with liberty
and
justice for all.
All right. Do we have any public communications?
No public comment.
Okay, fantastic. Chair Zaragoza, would you like to take over from here?
No, I may have to jump out fairly early for my flight. So thank you, Mike, for sharing today.
Fantastic. All righty. Well, our first order of business is a closed session. So I'm going to temporarily close this meeting so that we can go to closed session.
Thank you. I'm going to go ahead and transfer all the appropriate people into a waiting room, and I'll let you know when our streaming is stopped and we can begin closed session.
Thank you.
Okay, confirming that we are officially streaming.
Okay, terrific. Okay, we're going to resume the regular meeting of the Policy and Innovation Committee for SACOG. We have a consent calendar up next. There are 2 items on it. Do any directors want to pull one of those for discussion? If not, I'll entertain a motion.
I'm sorry, Mr. Chair. Just
Yes.
before we proceed with that, we should let the record show that there's no reportable action from closed session.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Move to approve the consent calendar.
Second.
Second.
Okay, we have a motion by Gog and a second by Zaragoza. Could you call the roll?
Okay, when I call your name, please indicate your vote. Director Bernasconi?
Yes.
Burris?
Aye.
Frericks?
Aye.
Gog?
Yes.
Lozano?
Aye.
Middleton?
Aye.
Stollard?
Aye.
Thomas?
Aye.
Zaragoza?
Aye.
And Vice Chair Kozlowski.
Aye.
The motion carries.
Okay. Okay, next item is action item number 4.
Good morning, Loretta Sue. So give me a minute just to start the presentation here. Okay, can everybody see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Good morning. This item is regarding SACOG fund balance policy. Staff is making some revisions to the policy and recommending the board approving the revised policy to reflect some of the action that was taken by the board back in April 2021, and then also other updates as required. Sorry, my apology here. Okay, sorry about that. So the purpose of this policy is to establish guidelines for SACOG to maintain adequate fund balance to mitigate any financial risks that could occur from unforeseen revenues, fluctuations, unanticipated expenditures, and any other special circumstances. The policy also in compliance with the Governmental Accounting Standard Board Statement, GASB 54. It also established guidelines for how the fund balance is being used and by what order the fund is being used. Since this policy has not been updated since 2011, so the revisions recommended that the policy will be reviewed by staff annually and make any recommendation on changes as part of the annual budget process. So just some overview of the updates and proposed changes that is included in the revised policy. First, I'm going to start off with the planning and administrative funds. Per GASB 54, these funds are accounted for in different categories. The first category is non-spendable fund balance categories. These includes prepaid expenses and inventories. The second item is the restricted fund balance. These funds balance have restriction imposed by grantors or external parties, and it only can be spent based on the funding restriction or limitation provided by the funders. Currently, there's approximately, as of June 30th, there's about 2.2 million, and we're projecting to have about 970,000 as of June 30th, 2021. These include the REAP funding that were provided to us through the HCD for the round one funding, and others restricted fund that including the GSI programs, some funds from the 4 county related to the paratransit projects, and then some other restricted funds that is currently on SACOG fund balance right now. The third category is committed fund balance. These fund balance are set up for specific purposes, and board action is required to establish, modify, or rescind any of these commitments. Currently, we have about 3.6 million that is classified as committed fund balance. These includes the board and advocacy fund. These has been accumulated over the fiscal year, and board action is required to authorize the use of these funds for any board expenses related. The second item is the community design projects. This is part of the SACOG managed fund that is used for community design grant projects awarded by the board in the funding round. With the most recent award that was included in the funding round, we estimated the balance at June 30th, it will be around $1.5 million. And also in April, the board took actions to dissolve the financing corp. So as of June 30th, 2021, there will not be any reserve or committed fund balance related to the financing corp. Instead, the board authorized the resolutions to set up a CalPERS employer pensions pre-funding program, and with the initial funding of $2 million that will be set up with the CalPERS Trust. The fourth category is the assigned fund balance. These funds are set aside for specific purposes, and same thing, the board authorized the executive director to assign the unrestricted fund balance transaction that going in and out of these accounts. So these are some of the reserves that are set up. The first one is the legal defense reserve. The board approved the use of these funds to pay for any expenses that related to the litigations filed against the 2020 MTP and SES projects. So approximately 275,000 was spent using these funds right here. So the board took action in April to increase the fund balance back to the 500,000. Also included in the reserve is the cell insurance, which is originally included in the policy, but because SACOG has insurance policy in place and staff does not feel the needs to have this 200,000 set aside for cell insurance. So in the revised policy, staff recommending eliminating that cell insurance reserve. Instead, there's the capital equipment reserve that is seeking to set up, which is to set up to use any unused balance from the annual budget and carry forward until a balance of 300,000 is reached. Anticipated balance right now is about 131,000. And lastly, staff is recommending establish of a contingency fund, or mostly this is more of a TDA carryover. This fund is used for future project work or as match for grants. Any fund and the fund through this process will be going through the annual budgeting process. So any unused funds should be carried over to the future years until $1 million is reached. So right now, sorry about that. And then the lastly is the unassigned fund balance. The fund balance, including a cash required to keep SACOG operating for a period of 3 months, which is approximately $3.2 million. Incremental funding will be occurred through the budgeting process as funds are available to fully fund to the required level. In April, the board took actions to increase the reserve by additional $625,000 from the dissolutions of the financing corp, and that brought the balance up to $2.2 million. Also included in the unassigned balance is the managed fund. This fund has been accumulated from local agency for reimbursement of projects originally expected to be complete with local fund, but instead it was funded with available federal transportation funds. So through these arrangements, SACOG is able to accumulate flexible local funds without any burden of state and federal restriction and process. Staff is working on a managed fund policy. So what's included in the revised fund balance policy is recommendations to use these funds for committed projects that is in the community design program, for funding exchanges with member jurisdictions, and also loans to other projects that are not qualified for use of the Federal Transportation Fund, also as a match for federal transportation funding or cash flow needs. So also included is board delegations to the executive director to borrow up to $1 million, which is the operating cash gap, from the managed funds for SACOG short-term cash flow needs should that required at any time. Also included in the fund balance is some of the major revenue special funds that SACOG is managed. These funds are restricted fund balance, and board action is required to either approve the annual budgets or the award of these funds, and then delegate the authorities to the executive directors to take any actions required to implement the program. Currently, these are the special revenue funds that SACOG is managed, that including the PEMC funds, which is approximately about $6.9 million right now. And then we have the State Transit Assistance Fund and the State of Good Repair Fund that makes up about $2.5 million. And then we have the Local Transportation Fund, which is the 4 counties LTF funds. That is a balance of $17.9 million currently. And then we also have the Capital Valley Safe and Glens County Safe Fund. That's about $3 million balance right now. And that totaling about $30.2 million. With that, I'm going to pause, see if there's any question related to this fund balance policy.
Directors, anybody with questions in this particular part of the presentation? Wave or jump in. All right, Loretta, I think you got it you got it clearly delineated for us. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, any commentary by other staff on this one? Okay, I will entertain a motion to accept this.
Move to approve item 4,
Second.
SACOG fund balance policy.
All right, we have a motion by Gog and a second by Middleton. Will you please call the roll, Robert?
All right. When I call your name, please indicate your vote. Director Bernasconi,
Yes.
Burris,
Aye.
Frericks,
Aye.
Gog,
Yes.
Lozano,
Aye.
Middleton,
Aye.
Stollard. Director Stollard, please indicate your vote.
Aye.
Thank you. Saragosa
Aye.
and Vice Chair Kozlowski.
Aye.
Motion carries.
Thomas is also an aye.
Excellent. Okay, item number 5, adopt the final budget and overall work program for fiscal year 2021-22. Also, Loretta.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you.
Let me give me a moment here. Okay, to start the presentation here. So, sorry. Okay, so this item is to seeking board to adopt the final budget and OWP for fiscal year 21-22. As required by the Fixing America's Surface Transportation Act, SACOG developed the budget and overall work program annually. The OWP defined transportation, air quality, and other planning activities that support the metropolitan planning process for the 6 county Sacramento regions. This process took several months to complete and involved many stakeholders, including external stakeholders like Caltrans, federal agencies, and local partners. Here's just a kind of overview of the timeline of where we are with this process here. Back in March, staff submitted a draft budget and OWP to Caltrans and federal agencies for review and comments. Comments were received back from Caltrans on April 1st and 1 additional comments on May 3rd. I will talk a little bit more about the comments a little bit. And then the board reviewed and released the draft budget and OWP in April for public comments. To date, there has not been any comments received from the public. So the final step in this process is to seeking board approval to adopt the final budget and OWP so staff can submit that to Caltrans and federal agencies for operations starting July 1st, 2021. Just going to highlight some of the changes from the draft to the final budgets. As mentioned, staff received comment backs from Caltrans and federal agency back in April. There were no fiscal impact to the budgets. There were just some minor updates to the overall work program that including some detailed description about outreach related to the COVID-19 effect, and then some updates to the project elements, and then also the revenue summary to reflect the carryover amount from the current fiscal year. So those are some of the comments and changes from Caltrans. So attachment J reflects all the comments from Caltrans and then also SACOG responses to those comments. So the final budget reflected a net revenue increase of approximately $727,000. This includes $471,000 from federals, $211,000 from service to others, which is mainly safe budgets, and then a net board increase of $39,000. So just to give an overview of what's included in SACOG budgets. So SACOG managed 2 separate budgets. The first one is the operation budgets. This includes the overall work program activities, Capital Valley Regional SAFE, SACOG managed funds, and then also capital asset and other local activities. And the board and advocacy budget includes activity related to the board, partnerships, and advocacy work. This is just to give an overview of the revenue summary for the fiscal year 21-22 comparing to fiscal year 2021. So total revenue for the fiscal year 21-22 is totaling $27.4 million, a decrease of $5.5 million comparing to fiscal year 2021. This is due to projects and funding that were ended or nearing completion in fiscal year 2021. These projects includes the Regional Bike Pet Data Collection Projects, Next Gen Transit, Big Data, REAP Round 1 fundings. Here's a quick overview of revenue by categories. As you see here, that's SACOG receive approximately 37% of the revenue from the federal governments, which includes the Formula Planning Funds, the Congestion Mitigation and Air Quality Fund, which is CMAQ, and then also the Regional Service Transportation Programs. The state make up about 27% of the total revenue. These includes the REAP funding, the SB1 formula and competitive grants. And then the local is about 19%. This is mainly the TDA funds that SACOG manage for the 4 county regions. And then service to other, which is mainly SAFE, it's about 11%, and other is 6%. As noted in the draft budget, this includes $526,000 use of the fund balance and other reserve in fiscal year 21-22. The expenditures for the budgeted year is totaling $22.8 million compared to $26.3 million, which is a decrease of $3.6 million. As noted, as revenue decreased, expenditures associated with these projects also decrease. Here's a quick breakdown of the expenses by category. Staff costs is approximately 46% of the total budgets. Consulting costs is 14%. And then pass-through cost is 24%. This is mainly the REAP funding that SACOG received from HCD that will be passing on to member jurisdictions. And then other directs and overhead, and it's about 15%, and local and capital is about 1% of the total all budgets here. And finally is the board and advocacy budget. This budget is totaling $950,000, an increase of $161,000 compared to fiscal year 2021. This budget includes the final increase of the membership dues of the 3rd year that was approved by the board in April. As a result, the use of the board and advocacy reserve fund is reduced by $100,000 from the original draft budget that was submitted in April. And here's the breakdown of the cost by category. Staff cost is approximately 49% of the total budgets. Partnership is about 10%. Advocacy is about 31%. And then board expenses is about 10%. This makes up the board and advocacy budgets. And then attachment I is a summary of the final budget for the board and advocacy. With that, I'm going to pause and see if there's any question related to the final budgets.
Directors, anybody? Okay. I wish that I had a very thoughtful question to give you right now, but the story is pretty clear, it seems. Is there any public comment on any of this?
No public comment.
Okay. All right. Directors, fair warning if you have comments or questions. All right. Well, I will entertain a motion. This is an action item, so we need to send this to the full board with action.
Happy to move the item. Thank you, Loretta, for all your work on this item.
Second.
Okay, we have a motion by Frericks and a second by Lozano. Would you please call the roll?
Okay, directors, when I call your name, please indicate your vote. Director Bernasconi,
Yes.
Burris.
Aye.
Thank you. Frericks,
Aye.
Gog,
Yes.
Lozano,
Aye.
Middleton,
Aye.
Stollard,
Aye.
Thomas,
Aye.
Saragosa,
Aye.
and Vice Chair Kozlowski.
Yes.
Motion carries.
Okay.
Thank
Chair Kozlowski, if you don't mind, if I might just say a couple things. Your last two action items here you just approved. Just a few things. One, 3 points. I'll run through them quickly. One is we're very well aware that especially this budget for this agency is quite complicated because we have so many different fund sources that are very restricted. But a couple of things. One is we are trying to be even in the budget a bit more transparent, top line, give you a digestible version of this. If you've ever read our OWP, it might make your head spin. So let us know, if you're getting the big picture, high level, right? This is a little bit different than your local government budgets, perhaps not. And that really also is a testament to Loretta and her team. And I know we often get up in this committee and we talk about all the very cool projects we're doing and the innovation and a lot of other things, but I've said it before, I'll say it again. Loretta and her team do an outstanding job for this agency and for all of you to really to keep us on track, and so we don't have a lot of issues. So I want to express my thanks and my sincere gratitude for. It doesn't often get the love or the headlines, and that's probably a good thing, but it is really important. Secondly, in the fund balance policy that you just approved in the prior vote, there's a piece of that is really important. And again, goes to the hard work of Loretta and her team, but also Eric and the transportation team. And that is, so many of our funds are restricted, even our transportation funds. And you probably all know, in some ways, the double-edged sword of getting federal funding for anything, including a transportation project. Sometimes you're not sure if it's worth the pain, especially if it's a smaller project. Part of that managed fund, and we keep a balance in that managed fund, and we do it for a very, very specific reason. And Director Saragosa would probably appreciate this among many others. We're able to loan out money on projects very quickly. Nimble is not a word our industry often uses in transportation anyway. And we have used this managed fund, I think, to great effect and to great benefit. And we have stepped in and I think played a role I want us to play more and more, both in terms of being nimble and making loans to projects so that they keep going, or they can grab use leverage and grab state and federal funds. So that managed fund is important. We're trying to grow that managed fund. We are trying to actually be able to, when we give you small community design grants, like say for like a city of Live Oak, and it's $500,000, you do not want that check to be written in federal funds, believe me. So you'll be hearing more about this. We are trying to, again, allow us to be nimble, and frankly, your staff to not spend all their time on paperwork, but actually on the things that really matter to your jurisdictions. And then finally, just the board and advocacy budget. I really want to express our gratitude again for the membership dues increase. I know it's never easy to get a dues increase. If you probably saw, maybe you did or didn't, it's a very small part of SACOG's budget, but speaking of flexibility and being able to do things we don't normally do, the board and advocacy budget really does allow us to do, I think, a lot of the things this committee in particular overseas, including a lot of our advocacy, bringing on new federal lobbyists that we'll be talking with you about, and you'll be hearing from them in the months ahead. So I just want to connect a couple of dots and say, I know sometimes it can be dry and very technical, but there's a couple of really important actions you just took, and largely it rests on some excellent work done by Loretta and her team. So thanks for that.
Thank you, James.
Yeah, hear, hear. Thank you for that context. That's excellent. Okay.
Director Pollard has his hand up.
Fire away.
I like the way the budget has evolved over time. To me, it's clearer and more rationalized in its presentation. So thank you so much for that. I wanted to say, in years past, SACOG sponsored more of its members to do things like Cap to Cap or the study missions. And then over time, SACOG started sending their own staff. That didn't used to happen. So that's good too. I understand that. But I especially wonder about some of our jurisdictions, which are very modestly funded, being able to participate in things like this. It's hard for all of us. I mean, some of the scholarships were 50%, as I recall. But I think if we want to build our collegiality and our collective participation in some of these things, like those great trips organized trips you've done, James, in the DC area. We should be looking at that board expenditure item as including some funding for this kind of purpose, so that people, let's just say, are never able to participate, who are never able to participate, can do so, and all of us might have some access to help. Thank you.
Excellent suggestion, Tom. All right. Okay, great. Well, let's move on to our information items. First up is Rosie Ramos with Public Participation Plan. Item number 6 on our agenda.
Good morning, everyone. Rosie Ramos, Project Manager for the Public Participation Plan Update, or the PPP, as I will say it several times during my presentation. I'm here today to talk about the Public Participation Plan and the update that we will be working on in the months to come. So I'll begin with a quick overview on what the PPP is, and then mention some key dates to keep in mind. So all metropolitan planning organizations like SACOG maintain a PPP, which informs our outreach processes for projects and programs, specifically the Metropolitan Transportation Plan and Sustainable Community Strategies, the MTP, and the Metropolitan Transportation Improvement Program, the MTIP. So MTP and the MTIP, those are specifically called out in our public participation plan. And the purpose of the PPP is to support SACOG staff in understanding those minimum requirements for when we go out to do our public communication and outreach for those two projects. So while the MTP, SES, and the MTIP are the only two projects that are specifically called out, we also want to create a plan, the PPP, to guide staff on best practices for outreach and communications, so that whenever we go out for any type of project, our engagement processes are accessible, transparent, and relevant. So what is in a PPP? Essentially three key things that I hope that you can take away from this. It's that it's a tool to ensure that we are meeting federal and state requirements when developing the outreach for the MTP, SES, and the MTIP specifically. It's a resource for staff to develop outreach plans so that we meet our requirements, but also incorporating best practices for other projects. So the Trails plan that we just did would be a really great example. While it's not called out specifically in the plan, it's a project that can pull from the best practices that we will include in it. And then finally, it's a document for the public to understand what they can expect from us in terms of a public engagement process. So it's not going to be the step-by-step, but rather the process for how we develop our outreach plans in the future. So while the PPP does have some parameters that we do have to meet, it is essentially the starting ground for engagement. And staff will use this document as a resource to ensure that we not just comply with state and federal guidance, but that we also create plans that have best practices all around. So that's a high level and summary of the PPP. I can pause here if anyone has questions before I go into the timeline.
Okay, I don't know how good it is, but I have a question. Okay. The distinction between the requirements for, say, federal funding and best practices, what's an example of a difference between those things? I'm curious.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I can actually follow up with more of the specifics. But for example, a state requirement would be that, okay, we open up the public or the MTP, right? Take the MTP, for example, that we open it up for public comment. We can open that up and we have a website, a link that has a plan and folks can interact with it. But a best practice would be to advertise it on social media, create the pop-ups that we have done in that's inviting, and have, stuff for the children to do while parents take the survey for us. So it's the PPP has those minimum requirements that says, you have to do X, Y, Z, like having the public comment period, or that you have to do X amount of events in a county, but it's the type of events that we want to have listed in the best practices. So it's not just a public hearing at 7 p.m. at City Hall, but rather that we're going out to the events at the community, locations like farmers markets or different events like that. That's one example.
Gotcha. Thank you. All right, other directors, any questions for Ms. Ramos?
Great. So I will share my screen really quickly, and you can ask questions afterwards as well. Just want to share the timeline that we're working with. And have that. Okay, so here you'll see just a visual representation of our timeline. This is the first of 3 visits that you'll have for me that are not YLA related. And so in the next few weeks, we will continue to develop the draft plan. And we plan to come to you in June once again so that we can highlight the new updates. And then we'll ask this committee to recommend to our board so that we can release the draft plan for a 45-day public comment period starting on June 17th. During this 45-day public comment period, staff will be working with partners in our jurisdictions and interested parties so we can gather input and feedback on the draft. And then we will come back, or sorry, the comment period will close on August 8th. And at that point, staff will take in all of the comments and changes that were recommended to finalize the draft final project or document. And the final draft PPP will come back to this committee in October, and then asking you to recommend it to the board for an adoption on October 21st. So that's going to be a timeline for us starting now through October. We're working on this PPP, and that concludes my remarks. I'll take any other questions if you have them.
The opposing mirror nature of doing public outreach about a plan for public outreach is kind of entertaining to me.
Yes, that's exactly what it is.
All right, directors, any other
questions? Like the committee on committees.
Yes, precisely.
It's a process for a process.
Yes, yes, yes. All right. Any other comments or questions, directors? Okay, well, great. Thank you, Rosie. Really appreciate that. James, any context or commentary on this one? Okay, fantastic. All right, let's move on to item number 7 then, the SACOG Regional Telework Pilot Initiative. Adrienne Moretz, you're up.
Hi, committee members. Today I'm going to Adrienne Moretz, your SACOG staff. Today I'm going to give you a quick update on the Regional Telework Initiative. It's been a little bit of time since I've been to this committee with an update, so I'm going to provide a little bit of history of where we've been with this pilot and how it fits into our broader program. So telework is a part of our Innovative Mobility Program, and Policy and Innovation Committee is the home committee for this overall work. Our current adopted framework, which was adopted in late 2019, is a $3 million program, the Innovative Mobility Program, and it's funded mainly with the federal dollars that Loretta was mentioning, congestion mitigation and air quality, so CMAQ money. And that means that the goal of our work in this program, any of the programs or projects that we do, is really in an effort to reduce vehicle miles traveled, or VMT, because that gets us closer to the greenhouse gas reduction targets set forth in our long range transportation and land use plan, the MTP, SES. So we do that mainly through 2 avenues in this program, Civic Lab and transportation demand management. Civic Lab was postponed, our latest cohort was postponed in 2020 due to the pandemic, and we're revisiting the design of that. And transportation demand management, or TDM, that contains our programs and strategies to change behavior and get people out of their cars into other modes. So you might think about May is Bike Month, which is active right now. Van pooling, guaranteed ride home, and telework, that all fits into transportation demand management. In the framework that we had adopted in late 2019, we didn't include telework. We had originally planned to bring that forward later in 2021, even in 2022. The pandemic had different plans for us. So in the Civic Lab spirit, we kind of pivoted and included telework in our programming this year. So since mid 2020, we have been working with participating employers from around the region to help understand what we might do to maintain some levels of telework in the long term and replace our commute trips to the office with telework days. So the goals and strategies that we developed in mid 2020 in coordination with this committee are in your attachment A. Before we kind of jump into the pilot itself, I do want to note, this is a small scale effort and it does contain limitations, right? So we only have 11 participants, 11 employers. They're white collar employers. So most employees can participate in telework. About half of these employees that have responded to our survey say they still are required to go to the office as an essential employee. So you might think about like an accountant that has to go do payroll, public works, but we do not have representation from like restaurant workers, hospitality, or places where a 9 to 5 Monday through Friday schedule is not typical. So we do have some limitations with this pilot. It's small scale. So with that, just a little bit of the history of where we've been, starting at the left-hand side of your screen in April. In the early stages of the pandemic, most people started to shift to telework when the shelter-in-place order started happening late March, early April 2020. So we know nationally, Bureau of Labor Statistics estimates 35% of the workforce moved to telework. Locally in our region, Valley Vision did a public opinion poll. It was only for the 4 counties of Yolo, Yuba, Sutter, and Sacramento, but it aligns with that national data where about 38% of our 4-county region moved to telework and about 34% maintained work in person. So there are, of course, as you can imagine and have likely heard about, big disparities in who can telework. So dependent on job function, income, education levels, gender, race, there's lots of things that affect telework rates, but regardless, many did shift to telework during COVID-19. So again, early in the pandemic, we also saw people started shifting to telework and VMT dropped. So people were driving much less early days of the pandemic, over 50% less than a typical year. But we saw kind of in the trend lines that as soon as VMT started to go down and immediately started to trickle back up, even as early as May 2020, we started to see increases in VMT. So we've been using a big data source called Replica, and we know that VMT has increased 10 to 15% or so since July 2020. So that puts us around the same amount of VMT we see in a typical year. So we're continuing to monitor VMT and see what travel patterns look like, but really more important now than ever, we want to maintain some levels of telework in the region. Then May and June 2020, we started to understand from the employer side, what might you need to maintain telework in the long term. So we had focus groups with over 30 employers. We heard a lot about telework policies. Some employers did not have telework policies at all. Some definitely needed to be revisited or were emergency policies because of COVID-19. We heard that employers needed help with IT, trainings for managers, and several other items. So based on that information and what we are seeing nationally, combined with VMT and the shelter-in-place orders, we designed the pilot project. So now I'm in the July through November in the center of your screen. We put a call out for applications for employers. We accepted 13 and 11 employers have moved throughout the pilot. During that time, we also brought on 3 expert vendors. They have expertise in IT, in policy, telework, transportation. And we started to understand from the employer side, what are you going to do going forward? What's the sentiment right now? What are the travel patterns like? What are your policies? And we heard pretty clearly that most were interested in and gearing up for flexible and hybrid workplaces going forward. So you might think about going into the office 2 or 3 days a week and working from home the other 2 days a week. Moving now to the right-hand side of the screen, that kind of leads us to now. We've done lots of employer consultations. We've done policy reviews. We've kind of done a lot of the legwork, and now we want to understand from the employee perspective, what are those behaviors like now? What were they during the midst of the pandemic, and what might they be going forward? So the survey that I'm going to talk about is not representative of our region. It's a small sample of the participating employers in this pilot, but it's still interesting for us to understand how we might prepare next steps for this pilot and how that might roll into bigger efforts that we undertake going forward. So these are detailed in your item, but these were kind of the bigger themes that came out of that survey we conducted with the employees, about 1,600 responses. You may notice that these don't seem like surprises. They're pretty consistent with what you've likely been hearing about nationally, what we're seeing in other places. So there are not really surprises that we've seen come out of this information. However, it's what we do next that we think is important because, we're kind of rolling out of the shelter-in-place orders, and we're at this kind of a central time right now where telework employers are deciding what they do next. I'm going to dive into each of these just a little bit and then talk about our next steps. So in the sentiment of employees generally like teleworking, they feel successful doing it. We saw in this survey that before the pandemic, about 7% of people teleworked 1 day a week or more. I know this may seem low, especially compared to the other two columns there, but actually nationally and regionally, telework was the fastest growing commute mode before the pandemic. So we had done a 2018 household travel survey that was representative of our region, and about 10% were teleworking 1 day or more. So there was a fair amount of people teleworking, although it seems small potatoes when you compare it to the midst of COVID-19. And then that kind of leads us to the right-hand side of this chart, which we asked employees, how much do you want to telework going forward post-pandemic? About half said at least 2 to 4 days a week, and 35% said 5 days a week, so full-time. So really that gets us to this 86% number where the survey respondents want to telework almost half the week. This is, again, consistent with what we see nationally. There was a University of Southern California survey that just came out last week, found very similar information. About half of teleworkers want to keep working from home at least half the week. So general consensus that people want to keep teleworking. And these were some of the things we heard as really important to maintaining telework going forward. So of course, flexibility in their schedule. That might mean you take a longer lunch to do an errand or pick up a child, and then complete your work later on in the evening. That was very important to people. Work-life balance. And we also saw pretty interesting statistics in this survey about productivity. Most respondents said that their productivity was being monitored appropriately and that they felt more productive during telework. That is something we've seen conflicting results from nationally. Sometimes we see, a little less productive, sometimes it's about the same, but generally employees in this survey felt pretty productive, and that's an important factor for them. This is not all sunshine and rainbows, although it may appear like that on the screen. We are now seeing anecdotally from a lot of our employers and employees in this pilot about burnout, lack of interaction, things you might also be hearing about. And so there's this kind of need for additional training and resources. That's a big focus for us right now. And we asked employees, okay, you like and feel successful teleworking, what will make you keep doing it in the future? They said two big things: flexibility from my manager and supportive telework policies. So that's a big focus of our expert consultants right now to make sure we're implementing those things appropriate. Second kind of finding is there is opportunity for reduced vehicle miles traveled through VMT. It may not be necessarily easy, but there is opportunity. In this survey, about 90% of our respondents drove alone before the pandemic, so a lot. That's much higher than the national rates or even rates in our region. But same statistic as a few slides ago, many people do want to keep teleworking at least 40% of their work week. So this is pretty consistent with what we found, again, from our household travel survey that is representative of our region in 2018, so before the pandemic. We found that people on days they teleworked drove less than average, but on days they did not telework, they drove more than average. So it's important for us to maintain some levels of telework here to help reduce vehicle miles traveled. Again, this is things that our respondents said were important to them when they, in their desire to keep teleworking. This doesn't really account for trips outside of work, but notable that commuting is a benefit to telework is that there is not a commute for most employees that are participating in this survey. So our plans are to break this down per employer to understand travel patterns at the more local level for these participants. For example, in the city of Sacramento, that's one of our participating employers. About 90% of the respondents drove alone before the pandemic, but 40% live within 5 to 10 miles of work. So what that tells us, if the infrastructure is there, that makes a really good case for micromobility, for public transit. So if we're assuming that people will still travel to the office on some days, we really want to make sure that our incentives are in place, that employees understand their transportation benefits, and that when new telework policies roll out, we're able to couple that with transportation demand management strategies, ways we can get them out of their car on days they do go to the office. And then finally, other finding, again, may not be a surprise to you, activities outside of work shifted pretty dramatically during the pandemic in this survey. Again, survey is not representative of the region, just of this pilot participants, but non-surprisingly, people used Amazon instead of going to pick up their items, used delivery services like Uber Eats instead of going to sit down at restaurants, and then did not attend farmers markets or local events like they would pre-pandemic. So that kind of leads us to our next steps. What do we do with this information? And first, we're going to break it down for each of our participating employers to understand at kind of the hyper employer level. What might we help do with travel patterns and transportation benefits? So we're going to have these individualized consultations and recommendations for each of our employers. And for the activities outside of work, we really want to understand that more. So we're endeavoring now on an economic assessment. That will likely be our next update to you as Policy and Innovation Committee. We're going to understand what shopping patterns were during the pandemic, what they typically are before the pandemic, and then compare that to telework rates historically during the pandemic and going forward. So we might hopefully understand how telework impacts local businesses. And then ultimately take learnings from this data, from this small survey, outcomes from our pilot projects, and fold that into the next innovative mobility framework that will be coming to you later this summer that we're developing. We also hope to inform our NTP and other projects at SACOG. So I'll stop there, answer any questions you might have. Thank you.
Okay, that's a lot to take in. I do have a generalized question though. The focus of the analysis seems to be on trips and job satisfaction type things that are around the people that are doing the work. The question I have is, have you thought about how to incentivize employers to spend the time creating a structure where it's easy to work from home? So either technology that's necessary, appropriate workspaces at home that might be necessary, and then just the structure of supervision that is entirely different when you're a remote worker or the boss of remote workers. So have you gone down that road at all yet?
Yeah, absolutely. Those are some of the fundamentals of the pilot. So you're right, hit the nail on the head there. Most of the employers in this pilot are now wrapping up or about to launch their revised or new telework policies, most all of which include some more simplified checklists, some more involved interactions or handholding when it comes to at-home office setups. So things like ergonomics and making sure you have all of the equipment you need. Some employers have offered hotspots or other things when there's a lack of internet access. So that is absolutely something that the employers have been doing and kind of figuring out. In the early days, it was a little bit reactive. Someone might say, I don't have internet, help, and they would give them a hotspot. Now it's a little more planned out. So when people are planning to telework for the long term, that they have the tools, resources, and things they need at home. So that's actually a very big component of the pilot. We're seeing a lot of policies that are incorporating that. A lot of policies are also incorporating things about job function. So some employers had outdated job functions where someone could have been able to telework before the pandemic, they just may not have been allowed to. There was some of that related to individual managers as well, or teams where the manager wasn't sure about telework, did not telework themselves, or wanted to see people in person. We're kind of lucky in that we were forced to telework in some ways because that allowed especially some teams or management to understand what it's like to monitor a staff person while you're not in person, right? So it's not based on when you can see them, but based on their work products. That varies by employer. We see some that are using like physical tools, some that are just doing regular check-ins with their employees. So that varies a lot. So yeah, the things that you were mentioning, Director Kozlowski, have been pretty key components. We will report next to you on the economic assessment, but then as we're getting outcomes on policies, trainings for managers are a big thing. All of those things will make widely available when the pilot concludes, because they might help others that are in the similar space.
Did any of the employers end up assigning somebody from their C-suite to be the chief work-at-home officer of sorts, to like systemically look at all these things rather than have it organically form out of necessity?
I have not heard that. Our employers vary from less than 10 people at an office to 20,000. We have quite the variety. Yeah. So in the very small employers, it's mostly been like a green team member or HR. It's a little more collaborative because they're so small. At the medium and larger size organizations, we have seen a lot of formation of telework committees that have representatives from just general staff to HR to IT. So that way it incorporates more perspectives, and they then can collectively go up to management. So I haven't seen one like chief telework officer, but more collaboration in terms of groups of people that are making recommendations.
Gotcha. Okay, great. Okay, are there other questions from directors? Adrian, great work, by the way. This is amazing. And I can't see everybody right now because the presentation is up. So jump in if you have a question.
All right, this is Director Thomas. I do have a question. Thanks, Mike.
Sure.
Adrian, great to see you this morning. And what an interesting exploration that you're involved in. It's important questions that you're asking. I look forward to the results. Quick question. Are employers that you're working with spread out over the SACOG region, or are they localized? And are you seeing discrepancies in the findings if they were done on a regional basis?
Yes, and perhaps. So we don't really have good representation across the entire region. We have a lot of public employers. So for example, City of Davis, City of Sacramento, Yolo County, Caltrans. So a good variety of local state employers. We did at the beginning of the pilot have more representation through small private employers. We had a pyrotechnics group that had started with us early in the pandemic, which was really exciting. However, we saw some attrition. To us, that's not surprising because small, especially private employers, right, are busy. They don't have the resources to dedicate to a pilot. So what that's telling us is that it's really important for us to share whatever learnings, make sure we have trainings, documentation, sample policies, all of the things that are happening in this pilot widely available going forward. So we have Sacramento and Yolo counties now. We had some Placer County representation early on, but we've seen a little bit of attrition.
Great. Well, thank you so much. Important work, and look forward to continuing this. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Other directors, any questions? I have one more, and maybe this one's for James or perhaps others, but is this particular work being represented in our presentations on Green Means Go? Because it feels like it is part and parcel of that whole mission that we've been pursuing.
It's a great question, Director Kozlowski. I think the honest answer is no at the moment. Not to say that when we think about these kind of green zones, broadband is one of those kind of utilities that we talk about. But I think it's really, I think it's an excellent question. So I really, because
this is evolving as we're talking, right? So it's the timing of it overlaps. I kind of knew the answer. I was just occurred to me that we should probably be incorporating these talking points as we go forward on Green Means Go. Essential analysis.
And clearly, I think as Adrian said, and I want to just emphasize, right, two of the things she said, which, I think are bearing out across the country, right? One is the jury is somewhat still out on the environmental benefits, on the vehicle miles traveled benefits. And in some ways, it reminds me of kind of the electric car debate, which is an electric car better than a typical car? Well, it all depends on where you're plugging in, right? It happens to be here, Pacific Northwest, we've got a pretty clean power grid. And so on balance, we're a lot better off here. Plugging in West Virginia may not be as good. And it's similar to which trips it displaces. And then I think we want to be really mindful, as Adrian did a great job of pointing out, that we're not talking about all trips and all employees, right? We're talking about a very white collar slice of employees who are important to displace those trips, or for other reasons in terms of creating the future workplace, right? Which is distributed and probably partially remote from heretofore. But there is a major equity question, I think, that's really important for us to kind of keep in mind in terms of people who don't have this option to telework, or what does it look like for people to be able to do more remote things? Anyway, just two things to flag for you.
Gotcha. Okay. All right. Other thoughts from anybody? Okay. Well, Adrian, really, really interesting work, and thank you very much for presenting it to us today.
Thank you.
Awesome. Okay. Well, let's move on to item number 8, which is our advocacy update. Christina, you're up. Green Means Go. Tell us all about it.
Thank you. Thanks, Christina Lockie, Policy Manager. I'm going to save Green Means Go towards the end of the presentation today because we have quite a bit going on both at the state level, but also at the federal level, which is a little bit new for us this year in terms of how much action and activity there is going on in DC. Excuse me. So as we've discussed, transportation remains a very active topic with numerous opportunities for SACOG to engage, including the possibility of an infrastructure bill and then reauthorization of the multi-year surface transportation law. SACOG has not had a federal lobbyist for the past several years, focusing more on state efforts, and then also due to the lack of activity in the transportation realm at the federal level. However, as we've discussed before, with these new opportunities in mind, we did release an RFP for a federal lobbyist. We received 4 bids, and an interview panel conducted interviews of the top 2 proposals, with the final selection going to Capital Transportation Consulting and Pavlichuk and Associates for a 1-year contract with the option to renew. So the primaries will be Devin Barnhart and Jason Pavlichuk, and they'll be working together to provide federal advocacy services for us. 2 of the main areas of focus in the near term are reauthorization of transportation funding and a potential infrastructure package. So on reauthorization, the FAST Act, so that's the bill governing transportation spending, that was originally set to expire last fall, but it was extended 1 year through September of this year. Now, in past years, the reauthorization process has often resulted in multiple years of 1-year renewals, et cetera, as they work towards an agreement on a final package. However, things do seem to be moving very quickly this year to potentially try to finalize a final reauthorization package. Both in the committees in both the Senate and in the House are expected to focus on reauthorization the last week of this month, with the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, which is the main policy, if you will, committee for reauthorization in the House, and then the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee, which is one of a few committees dealing with reauthorization on the Senate. Both of those committees will be marking up their respective bills later this month, essentially going through the amendment process. In the House, we do expect to see something very similar to what they introduced and passed last year, HR 2, the Invest in America Act, or the Investing in New Vision for the Environment and Surface Transportation in America Act. And this was an almost $500 billion proposal, which was essentially a 5-year transportation reauthorization proposal embedded within a larger infrastructure package. Now, things are going to look very different in the Senate. First, in the Senate, the jurisdiction, as I said, over reauthorization is spread out across a number of committees. So EPW, the Environment and Public Works Committee, covers only the highway portion. They're also the only committee so far in the past, with reauthorization or with the FAST Act expiring, they were the only committee to pass a reauthorization proposal leading up to the expiration. And they did this in 2019 with bipartisan support. Their proposal was America's Transportation Infrastructure Act, and it authorized almost $300 billion over 5 years. And it was a pretty unanimous proposal coming out of the committee. Despite this previous bipartisan support, though, it appears now that reaching an agreement this year is going to be much more difficult in the Senate, not to mention many differences in terms of an agreement, trying to reach an agreement between the House and the Senate, and then you throw in the administration as the third party in these negotiations. It's also unclear if the final reauthorization proposal will be part of an infrastructure package similar to like we saw in the House, or if it's going to be a kind of two-step process. So a lot likely happening in the next couple of months, and Devin and Jason are already very active and engaging on these issues for us in DC. And we're scheduling them to present to this committee next month at the June committee meeting to both provide an introduction and then as well as an update since there is so much activity going on at this time. So that's it on the federal side. I'll pause here to see if there's questions before I go on to Sacramento.
I think we should send Tom Stoller to Washington, D.C. to do some lobbying.
Nice laugh there, Mike. Thank you. I'm ready to get out of Dodge.
We all are. I think your suggestion was a good one. We can help.
All right, not seeing any questions. I'll move on then to state focus in Sacramento. So the next few weeks are really going to be focused on bills in the Appropriations Committee, so bills that have a state cost, and then also the state budget negotiations. And that's really due to the deadlines we're at this time of year. In early June, legislators will have until June 4th to get their bills out of the House of Origin. So essentially the Senate must get all of their bills off of the Senate floor and over to the Assembly, and then vice versa with the Assembly bills. And then we'll also see the final last couple of weeks of negotiations for the state budget in June as they have to pass a budget by June 15th. As you see in your staff report, SACOG has taken a position on 12 bills so far this year per our board adopted advocacy principles and policies. And these bills are primarily related to transportation, housing, economic prosperity, and broadband. And we also continue to engage on the SB 375 related proposals that I've previously briefed the committee on. These are the bills that are related to changes to our sustainable community strategy process. Of note, the two Senate bills, SB 261 and SB 475, have become two-year bills, as many have advocated for. So essentially what that means is it gives us through the end of this year to negotiate on those proposals before the bills will begin to move forward next year. The third bill, Assembly 1147 by Assemblymember Friedman, that bill does continue to move forward, and there continues to be a lot of discussions about amendments. And we're working quite a bit through CalCog on all of these bills and do not yet have a formal position on any of them. I do want to note on 1147, we talked about this bill last month. One of the main provisions of the bill is to establish a sustainable community strategy implementation block grant. And the author, Assemblymember Friedman, is advocating for $250 million in state funds to fund the proposal. And while it looks very similar to Green Means Go, we are continuing to push for a specific program for our region due to the focus that we've had with Green Means Go, as well as the amount of money we're asking for. Our ask is closer to $100 million of the state, if Friedman was able to get 250 million for her proposal, we'd likely get somewhere in the $10 to $15 million range. So on that, I'll now talk a little bit about Green Means Go. Our advocacy for Green Means Go remains strong. First, with Devin and Jason on board, our new federal lobbyists, we're able to also have more of a focus on potential federal funding for Green Means Go. There's, a lot of opportunity within these opportunities I've talked about at the federal level, plus, obviously additional options as well. And so they're already having conversations about potential options to try to identify some federal funds to help us with Green Means Go. In Sacramento, Dr. Pan continues to lead our delegation in advocating for inclusion of funding in the state budget. Our focus is now exclusively on the state budget as AB 1209, which, if you might remember, that was our policy bill this year to set the framework for the funding. That bill is not going to be moving forward through committees. The bill was referred to two committees. First, the Transportation Committee, and then if it passed that, it would have gone to the Housing Committee. The chair of the Transportation Committee, Assemblymember Friedman, the author of AB 1147, this is her first year chairing the committee, and she did not want to hear the bill because in her mind, it was more of a budget bill since it would need to receive funding through the state budget process. And she wants to establish a process for her committee that only focuses on policy requirements, policy change requirements that are needed, and not just exclusively budget requests, essentially. And just a reminder, we chose to introduce a policy bill this year for the first time, really to set the Green Means Go framework in state statute, and then to have a policy bill to organize around. That's a lot easier than trying to do the budget request, as we've all learned through this process is a lot of not necessarily clear process in how it happens. It's a lot of backroom conversations. So having a policy bill with set deadlines and committees just makes it a little bit easier to organize around. And so with AB 1209 already, we were able to have many, many positive conversations about Green Means Go and get a lot more support for the Green Means Go proposal than we've had in the past. And that has really helped immensely as we work on the state budget request, which is the primary focus and what we really need to have happen in order to get the funding. And it also really helped to better engage members of our assembly delegation, and we're able to capitalize on that in their interest in working to push to get this funding for us included in the state budget. And I think along with all of our budget conversations we've been having with Green Means Go, all of this has also really helped set up the argument for state funding for sustainable community strategies implementation, like what Green Means Go is essentially trying to achieve, and similar to some of the other proposals we're starting to see now crop up. In terms of process for state budget and timeline, the governor will be releasing his May revised budget proposal this Friday by the end of the week. And this is essentially an update to his January state budget. And it's to reflect any changes in state revenue and spending proposals. Unlike last year, where the state began with an estimated almost $50 billion deficit, I shouldn't say began, but after the pandemic began, they were looking at about a $50 billion deficit. The state is amazingly awash in surplus funds this year. The January budget estimated a surplus of $15 billion. And today at a press conference, the governor just announced that he's looking at a surplus of just over $75 billion for the state. And this is in addition to the $26 billion in federal funds from the latest coronavirus relief package that was passed in March. And those federal funds come with a lot of flexibility on how to be spent. So a lot of money, a lot of it's one-time funds, and the state is expected to potentially see a deficit as soon as next year. So there's probably going to be a lot of focus on one-time spending proposals. And even though this is quite a bit of money, there are just as many proposals on how to spend it all, from the legislature to the governor. And it looks like the governor is going to be going on a bit of a tour this week, announcing various plans on how to spend this money. I think it sounds like a new proposal each day of the week, kind of leading up to his formal May revised release at the end of the week. But all that to say, there's a lot of opportunity there when it comes to Green Means Go funding. Once the governor releases his May revise, this essentially kind of kicks off the final legislative review of any new proposals through the budget subcommittee process before each house's budgets will go to their full budget committee for vote. And then there'll likely be a conference committee where the Senate and the Assembly will work out any differences between their two budgets. And the legislature must pass a budget bill by June 15th, according to the Constitution, or else they will lose pay. And in the recent past years, we've seen them meet that deadline. Now, that doesn't mean we should expect the conversation to be over on June 15th. Even if there is a signed budget bill, the legislature can still pass additional budget bills, which we tend to see, and we will likely see this year and probably should expect to see this year. Of note, it is unlikely there'll be an agreement on the use of the additional federal funds that I mentioned. Treasury just today released its announcement about the availability of the funds, providing some additional guidance on how the funds can be spent. So there is a chance we might not even see those funds crop up in any May revised proposal, just given the timing of all of this. But I do want to note that water, sewer, and broadband infrastructure are explicitly called out as eligible projects. So there is some additional opportunity for Green Means Go there. And then in terms of timing, when this all for sure has to wrap up, the legislature is on recess from mid-July to mid-August, and then they will adjourn for the year September 10th. So that's essentially a good estimate of when we should have a final idea. And so just to close it out, our conversations around Green Means Go have continued to remain positive, particularly in light of these current numbers. We've been meeting with budget staff, leadership. I think I mentioned last month, Dr. Pan has led a delegation to meet with Department of Finance. In addition to Dr. Pan's efforts, Senator Nielsen has also been very engaged and supportive. And in the Assembly, Assemblymember Cooley has been leading the Assembly delegation in advocacy to Assembly budget staff and leadership on the importance of the Green Means Go funding. And so with that, I will end, see if there's any questions.
As always, very thorough. Thank you. I do have one question, and just kind of going back to 1209 and the maybe grain of conflict with Assemblymember Friedman. If we were proposing a policy bill and she wanted to stay within some guardrails about policy rather than get into budget discussions, what was maybe you could just back over that discussion point. I'm confused about that.
Sure. So essentially what we were doing with AB 1209 was putting in statute the framework for Green Means Go. So how the funding could be spent, et cetera. But it would require an appropriation from the state. So it would require money to be included in the state budget. We technically do not need to have that authorization in order to get the state funding. And so that's why in the past we haven't had a policy bill, because they can do that through either they really could even do it through a direct allocation in the state budget. But assuming that they want to put some guardrails around it, they could put that framework in what's called a budget trailer bill, which is essentially the policies of how to implement the budget. So technically, we didn't really need to have the policy bill. However, we thought it would be helpful to show the legislature and have in statute, the guidelines and the parameters for how the funds could be spent. It puts a little bit more of a framework around it than just putting it in the budget. But that's kind of the back and forth that we had there.
So is there another avenue to place that policy stuff in permanently in statute besides the budget? Because we get unfunded mandates all the time jammed down our throats at cities. And I'm just wondering if, I know we're trying to do it to the state, so it's the tables are turned, but is there some other way to word that stuff to get it into policy or get it into state policy?
So yeah, essentially it would be through what's called the budget trailer bill language. And so we've been working, so if you think about the state budget passes and it's just a bunch of, departments and numbers with some control language about how to spend the money. And then they pass a whole bunch of bills with that, 5 to 15 to 20 bills that are these budget, the trailer bills, which are essentially how you're going to implement that. And that's where you see the changes to statute happening. And so what we did actually last week, after very positive conversations with the Assembly budget staff person that would be overseeing this, is we're working with Assembly Member Cooley to basically take the language in AB 1209 and put that into language that could be then placed into a bigger trailer bill. So it's the same process. It's essentially the same language you would see. It's just a different mechanism.
Okay, thank you. Yeah. All right, very good. Directors, any other questions, comments, advice? Wave or holler out, because I can't, some of you have your cameras off.
And if I could just add, I just want to thank all of our directors for their engagement on Green Means Go. It's been, I think we've mentioned this before, but it's been instrumental, particularly in getting our legislative delegation to really engage and focus and push and make this a priority. So it's been very, very helpful, and we're very appreciative of all the work that all of you have been doing to help us.
Terrific. Yeah, it is righteous work for sure for all of us. James, any follow-up to any of this?
No, I would, just to build up Christina's comments, Chair Kozlowski, you asked about the policy bill. In some ways, what the policy bill allows us to do is when the legislature says, wait, why would we give you $100 million to Sacramento region? What would you do with it, right? It's our answer. And that's a fair question. They should ask that. Look, Chris, maybe like I said about Loretta earlier, Christina, I know you all know this, has just done so much hard work on this. We have been greatly assisted by KP Public Affairs. Last year was kind of a non-year in some ways. Everything turned upside down. And certainly my experience is you got to be in the right time at the right place with these things, but you have to do your homework and you have to be persistent. And hopefully all those things are coming together this year. And we have certainly done our homework and we have been persistent. So when we're in these conversations that, with Christina and KP in the legislature, we can actually answer now all of the tough questions they throw at us. What would you do with this? Which cities are involved? How many housing units would you unlock? What would that mean in terms of greenhouse gas emissions? What are the demographics of we can answer all of those questions that 2 years ago we couldn't have. So there's a lot of that that is almost the necessary but not sufficient. Mm-hmm. And we hope this year with that one-time surplus and the federal funds, we're in the right time at the right, we're in the right place, right time. That remains to be seen. But as Christina said, thank you so much for being using some of your political capital and your elbow grease and your Zoom grease and everything else you all have done. So it's a bipartisan effort here. Pretty rare these days in the legislature. So stay tuned.
Well, you make your own luck, right? So good work to everybody for getting us prepared for this unique moment in time. All right, fantastic. Other directors, anything? All right, thank you, Christina. Thank you. Our last item is a receive and file quarterly contracts report. Probably doesn't need any discussion. Any other matters or other topics, James, that you'd like to bring to our attention?
No, I just say we're looking forward to seeing you all again next week, obviously for the board meeting. We are trying to lock down our potential board workshop on the regional parks and trails plan, kind of moving around with some speakers. So just stay tuned for that. But I think as maybe some of you heard, you didn't get a presentation today on parks and trails, but again, thank you for all of you that shared that Maptionaire survey tool over social media with your staff. Our staff here, Victoria Cacciatore, Rosie Ramos, and many others were aiming for 1,000 surveys to get filled out. We had to pivot very quickly in the pandemic, not doing anything in person. We're north of 3,000 on those surveys. We did have to close it, and Some of you were unhappy with me because we closed it on May 3rd. We held it open for 4 days, and it's a problem I'd rather have is for people to be banging down the door, trying to get more survey results in. But we are going to use those, and this again gets into the next phase of this work now around this regional parks and trails plan, which I think is super exciting. If we can get we're trying again nail down our workshop speaker for May. If we can get one. A little bit of scheduling and other kinds of challenges. So stay tuned for that, but also just look forward to seeing you all. If I don't see you this afternoon for the Strategic Planning Committee, look forward to seeing you all next Thursday for the full board meeting.
Excellent, thank you. Well, and I will just note that our next meeting of the Policy Committee is on Monday, June 7th.
Mr. Chair,
at
I think
10 a.m.
Director Lozano had his hand up.
Oh, I'm sorry, Rich, go ahead.
That's okay, Mike. James, I just had a quick question. This might not be the right place, but I'm thinking somebody else is thinking asking the question as well. In terms of that survey, is there a way to get a breakdown by jurisdiction of the responses? And the only reason I ask is city staff for us is really good about getting that stuff out. That was one of the first surveys or pieces of information that we put out using a different, more robust method of getting it out. And so I would just be curious to see what our response was, and certainly in the city of Galt, but I'm thinking others might be interested in that as well.
Duly noted, and rather than me be unsure about my response, we'll get you the right answer.
Thank you.
All right, well, a final thank you to Casey, Loretta, Renee, Rosie, Christina, Eric, Robert, Kirk, and James, and everybody that's behind the scenes. Directors, we meet again on June 7th for this committee meeting, and it is 11:43, and we are adjourned. Thank you.